The sound of 10,000 souls holding their collective breath was a tangible thing. In the grand hall of echoes, King Hadrian of the Night Court stood alone on the dais, a single fall of moonlight catching the silver threads in his black formal coat. He was stillness and power, a statue carved from shadow and authority. He let the silence stretch, a trick he'd picked up decades ago from a human diplomat he'd once admired. Let them lean in. Let them hunger for it. Then he spoke. "We stand tonight, not on the precipice of war." His voice rolled through the hall, a resonant baritone that had calmed rebellions and charmed foreign courts, but at the dawn of a fragile peace. A collective sigh rippled through the assembled vampires, a sound of relief and reverence. Miles away, in the highest room of the castle's forgotten East Tower, Nyx Ashmore rolled her eyes so hard she felt a muscle twinge. "No, no, you magnificent idiot," she muttered, shoving a stray strand of black hair from her face. She was hunched over a brass device humming with a faint magical energy, an aural conduit, the court's arcane equivalent of a baby monitor. The pause goes after war. It's a subversion of expectation. You're supposed to let them think you're going to say war, then hit them with peace. It's Rhetoric 101. Did you learn nothing from the Thornfield draft? On her cluttered desk, surrounded by teetering stacks of books on etymology, political theory, and ancient dialects, the original parchment lay scrawled with her furious notes. The line was clearly marked. "We stand tonight not on the precipice of war, but at the dawn of a fragile peace." He had counted to 1, maybe 1.5. It was sloppy. For 3 years, Nyx had been the sole architect of King Hadrian's legendary eloquence. From a dusty room no one had bothered to clear out since the last resident, a melancholy poet, had dramatically flung himself from the window a century prior. He'd survived. It takes fire or a blade through the chest to kill a vampire, not gravity. Though his dignity had not been so lucky, but had been too embarrassed to ever return. She spun words that shaped the nation. She wrote the speeches that ended border disputes, the proclamations that settled old feuds, the eulogies that made hardened generals weep into their silken handkerchiefs. And she had never once met the man who spoke them. Her predecessor had retired, and the king's advisor, Lord Marin, had found her through a recommendation from the Royal University, one of the Night Court's hidden institutions, tucked behind the facade of a crumbling estate in the English countryside that humans had long since stopped visiting. She'd been a promising, if antisocial, linguistic scholar, 82 years old, which in vampire terms still carried the faint whiff of youth, though she'd long since stopped tolerating anyone who pointed it out. The offer was simple: a lifetime stipend, access to the Royal Library, and complete anonymity. She would live in the East Tower, receive requests via messenger, and send back finished speeches. In return, she would never have to attend a single court function, engage in mind-numbing political small talk, or pretend to be impressed by anyone. It was, in short, the perfect job. The anonymity was essential, and not just for her comfort. Lord Marin had explained it in his dry, pragmatic way during her first week. The king had once lost a speechwriter to assassination. Lord Fenwick, 60 years ago, had been excellent. So excellent that the king's enemies decided the fastest way to silence the crown was to silence the pen. They'd burned Fenwick's quarters while he slept inside, barring the doors with iron. Fire was one of the few things that could actually kill their kind, and the attackers had known it. After Fenwick's death, the position was made deliberately invisible. No name on any public record. No visitors. All correspondence through Marin's office alone. The king himself had agreed never to seek out the writer's identity. His reasoning, apparently, was that knowing who they were would make him self-conscious about the delivery. "He prefers to think of you as a kind of oracle," Marin had told her. Faceless, genderless, issuing brilliant pronouncements from a stone tower. It suits his sense of drama. It suited Nyx just fine. Her only professional complaint was the delivery. King Hadrian, from what she could gather, was a perfect vessel. He was 153, nearly twice her age, which gave him the kind of seasoned gravitas that couldn't be faked. He was handsome in that confident, slightly weathered way that vampires got after their first century. Not ancient and timeless, but sharpened, like a blade that had been used. He had a voice like thunder wrapped in velvet. He knew how to hold a room. But he was, at the end of the day, an actor. A glorious, royally bred figurehead who took her carefully constructed symphonies of language and occasionally played a wrong note. For our strength is not in the steel of our swords, Hadrian's voice filled her room again, but in the steel of our resolve. Nyx winced. It's a bit cliché, isn't it? I told Maren that line was a placeholder. She'd written a much better alternative involving the metaphor of a mountain versus a river, but it had been rejected as too philosophical for the general staff. Apparently, the general staff preferred their metaphors to involve things they could stab people with. She scribbled a note on a scrap of paper, *RE: resolve speech. The steel metaphor is tired. Suggest we workshop alternatives. Perhaps something about the enduring nature of granite? Or the quiet persistence of a glacier? Also, you're rushing the tripartite structure. She folded it, sighing. It would be sent via the pneumatic tube system that connected her tower to the administrative offices. A strange, gasping network of pipes that was the pinnacle of 19th century vampire innovation and was now mostly used to send her laundry lists and complaints about comma splices. The speech ended. Thunderous applause echoed through the conduit. Nyx switched it off, plunging her sanctuary back into the familiar, comfortable silence, broken only by the whisper of pages turning and the frantic scratching of her quill. She reached for her cup, a wide ceramic bowl chipped at the rim, currently holding a cooling brew of silver needle white tea. She lifted it to her face and inhaled. The aroma was delicate, floral, faintly sweet, like standing in a garden that existed only in memory. She closed her eyes and let the steam curl against her skin. Nyx couldn't taste tea. No vampire could taste anything except blood. But she could smell it. And smell, for vampires, was a sense so acute it bordered on the hallucinogenic. A good tea, properly brewed, was an entire landscape in a cup. She'd been collecting rare varieties since university. White teas from Fujian, aged pu'er that smelled like forest floors and deep thyme, a smoky lapsang souchong that reminded her of autumn bonfires she'd only ever read about. She brewed them in the little iron pot on her desk, drank them slowly, even though the liquid sat uselessly in her stomach until her body quietly rejected it, and found that the ritual, the heating of the water, the timing of the steep, the first inhalation, was the closest thing she had to meditation. Other vampires found this habit somewhere between baffling and mildly disturbing. Lord Maren had once watched her brew a pot of Darjeeling with the expression of a man observing someone talk earnestly to a houseplant. She didn't care. It helped her think. She looked around her circular room. Books overflowed from shelves, forming precarious towers on the floor. Maps of forgotten territories were pinned to the stone walls. Tins of loose-leaf tea occupied an entire shelf that should have held reference texts, organized by region and oxidation level with a precision that she applied to absolutely nothing else in her life. It was chaos with one small island of obsessive order. It was heaven. She was safe up here, insulated from the viper's nest of the night court. Down there, every word was a weapon, every compliment a threat. Alliances shifted like sand, and a misplaced pleasantry at a royal banquet could get you exiled to the northern wastes for a decade. Nyx had seen it happen to her own family. Not a distant abstract fall from grace, but a specific, devastating one. Her mother had been a lady-in-waiting to the previous queen. Her father had been a minor lord with ambitions exactly one size too large for his talent. They had accepted an invitation to a private supper hosted by Lord Cassian, then a rising star at court, and her father, emboldened by blood wine and flattery, had shared his opinions on the king's trade policy. Opinions that happened to contradict Cassian's faction. Within a week, her father's modest estate was seized on a pretext of unpaid levies. Her mother was dismissed from service. They were relocated to a crumbling holding in the northern wastes, where her father spent the next 40 years writing increasingly desperate letters of appeal that were never answered. Nyx had been 11. In vampire years, that was still genuinely 11. Old enough to understand what had happened, young enough that the understanding carved itself into bone. She'd learned her lesson. The only way to win the game was not to play. Up here, words were her tools, not her chains. She could build worlds with them, shape reality, and then slide the finished product under the door and go back to her books. King Hadrian could have the applause. All she wanted was the quiet. The quiet was shattered 2 nights later by a frantic pounding on her door. Not the polite, hesitant knock of the servant who delivered her blood rations twice a day, always left outside the door as per her instructions. This was a panicked, existential drumming that suggested the door was personally responsible for all the world's ills. Nyx froze, her quill hovering over a draft of a trade announcement concerning blood tariffs. No one ever knocked. Ever. It was the first rule of her sanctuary. "Go away!" she yelled, her voice hoarse. "Miss Ashmore, it is a matter of supreme and catastrophic urgency." The voice was familiar, thin, frayed, and perpetually on the verge of giving up. Lord Marin. Nyx's heart sank. Marin only came in person for disasters. The last time had been when a visiting duke had misinterpreted one of her speeches as a declaration of love and a formal marriage proposal. It had taken 3 weeks and a very carefully worded sonnet about friendship to untangle that mess. She sighed, pushing back from her desk. Her sanctuary was about to be breached. She trudged to the heavy oak door and pulled it open. Lord Marin stood there, looking even more haggard than usual. His normally immaculate black coat was askew, and his pale, gaunt face was tight with barely contained panic, the muscles of his jaw working in that involuntary ghost reflex that vampires never quite outgrew. The body remembering stress, even when the blood had long since stopped cooperating. "Marin," she said flatly. "The building is on fire, I assume?" Given what had happened to Fenwick, it wasn't entirely a joke. "Worse," he rasped, clutching a stack of documents to his chest like a shield. "The Ironwood Fae." Nyx felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty tower. The Ironwood Fae were notoriously difficult. They communicated primarily through riddles, took offense at direct sunlight, a sentiment vampires shared, but the Fae were just dramatic about it, and considered the word please a mortal insult. The king was scheduled to host their delegation for a summit in 2 days. A summit meant to prevent a looming territory war over the Whispering Glens, one of the contested borderlands where the hidden vampire territories brushed up against Fae holdings, concealed from human eyes by old, layered enchantments. "What about them?" Nyx asked, already knowing she wouldn't like the answer. "Lord Cassian was handling the preliminary welcome address," Marin said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Nyx groaned. Lord Cassian was a pompous, overstuffed peacock of a vampire who had been the king's speechwriter before her. He believed flourishing adjectives could solve any political crisis, and had once tried to avert a famine by writing a particularly moving ode to the harvest moon. He'd been demoted to writing welcome addresses for minor dignitaries, a post he considered a grave insult. That Cassian was also the man who had hosted the supper that destroyed her family was a fact Nyx kept in a locked drawer in her mind, right next to her opinions on the Oxford comma, strong, and her feelings about social gatherings, violent. "Let me guess," Nyx said, leaning against the doorframe. "He used too many superlatives and accidentally called the Fae Queen's sacred bog quaint." Marin's eyes widened in horror. "How did you know?" Lucky guess. So he's been exiled? Worse. The Fey Queen has demanded he personally apologize by spending a week submerged in the bog. His Majesty has agreed to the terms. Cassian departs at dawn. Nyx blinked. That was unexpectedly satisfying. She filed the emotion away to examine later, preferably with tea. So I need to write a new welcome address. Fine, send me the brief. She started to close the door. Marin put a hand out to stop it. No, not just a welcome address. The entire summit speech, from scratch. The original framework is compromised. The Fae consider Cassian's prose a formal act of aggression. Nyx stared at him. In 2 days? A summit speech for the most belligerent, thin-skinned magical beings on the continent? It's impossible. It is essential, Marin corrected, his voice regaining a sliver of its usual authority. The stability of the western border depends on it, which is why His Majesty has decided to take a more personal hand in its creation. A cold dread, far worse than the Fae, washed over Nyx. What does that mean? Marin wouldn't meet her eyes. He stared at a point just over her shoulder, as if fascinated by a particularly interesting patch of cobwebs. It means he will be working with you, directly, here. He has invoked the Fenwick exception, the security protocol that allows direct contact in cases of imminent diplomatic crisis. Nyx's brain short-circuited. Here? In her sanctuary? The king? The handsome, empty-headed vessel for her words was going to come into her room and… what? Watch her write? Offer his no-doubt terrible ideas? No, she said. The word was flat and absolute. Miss Ashmore. Absolutely not. The entire arrangement is predicated on my anonymity, on my solitude. I don't work with people. People are distracting and they smell weird. He is the king, Marin said, as if that explained everything. He is a delivery system, a very effective one, I grant you, but I am the architect. You don't ask the newsreader to help the journalist write the story. Nyx, Marin said, and the use of her first name was a low blow. He sounded so tired, so deeply, cosmically tired. The Fae are threatening to turn the royal gardens into a swamp. The king believes his direct input is the only way to strike the precise tone needed. He is insistent. She saw the desperation in his eyes. Marin had served the crown for over a century. He was loyal, competent, and perpetually run down by the endless drama of immortal politics. He was also the only person in the entire castle who had ever treated her like a person rather than a reclusive oddity. She let out a long, slow breath, the fight draining out of her. Her perfect, quiet world was about to be invaded by 6'3" of regal, empty-headed majesty. Fine, she bit out. When is he coming? Marin looked relieved. He is on his way. Of course he is, Nyx muttered, turning back into her room. The chaos that had seemed so comfortable a moment ago now felt like a personal failing. There were open tins of loose-leaf tea on priceless folios. Her ink-stained work smock was thrown over a chair. A half-brewed pot of lapsang souchong was slowly going cold next to a 14th century treatise on demonic pacts. It was a disaster zone. She frantically started trying to stack books into neater piles. Oh, and Miss Ashmore? Marin called from the doorway. What? She snapped, trying to relocate the lapsang souchong to somewhere less incriminating. He believes you to be a rather eccentric, elderly gentleman named N. Ashmore. The security protocols describe the speechwriter in deliberately vague terms. He has simply assumed. Nyx stopped. She slowly turned to face him. You're telling me the king thinks I'm an old man? It has simplified the security narrative immensely, Marin said with a weak, apologetic smile. He will be here momentarily. Good luck. He scurried away before she could throw a book at him. Nix stood in the middle of her room, her mind reeling. She was about to meet the most powerful man in the kingdom, a man whose public persona she had single-handedly crafted for 3 years, who thought she was a crotchety old man, and who was about to personally supervise her while she tried to avert an interspecies war. She looked at her ink-stained fingers, her messy bun, her worn-out trousers. She looked at the tea-stained treatise on demonology. "Well," she said to the empty room, "this is going to be a catastrophe." 10 minutes later, firm, authoritative footsteps echoed up the spiral staircase. They stopped directly outside her door. Silence. Nix held her breath, staring at the wood grain as if she could see through it. The silence stretched. 1 second, 2, 5, 10. What was he doing out there? Was this some kind of power move? Finally, a knock. Sharp, precise. 3 distinct raps. Nix took a deep breath. "It's open!" The door handle turned, but the door only opened a crack before stopping. Through the gap, she saw a sliver of a black coat and a single, piercingly blue eye. The eye surveyed the room, then fixed on her. Another long, awkward silence. "Are you coming in, or are you inventorying my dust bunnies?" Nix asked, her patience already worn thin. The voice that answered was the one from the oral conduit, but deeper, closer, and laced with an unmistakable thread of regal confusion. "You must invite me in." Of course, vampire custom. A vampire couldn't enter a private dwelling without an invitation from the person who lived there. It was a rule so old nobody remembered why it existed, only that breaking it was physically impossible. The fact that he technically owned the entire castle was irrelevant. This room was hers. A tiny, wicked smile touched Nix's lips. Oh, this was interesting. "Why?" she asked, feigning innocence. The blue eye blinked. "It is the custom." "Seems inefficient," she said, tapping her chin. "What if there's a fire? Do you have to wait for a formal engraved invitation before you can rescue someone?" "The circumstances are rarely so dire," the king said, his voice tight with controlled exasperation. "Mr. Ashmore, we have a summit to prepare for." Mr. Ashmore. Right. This was going to be fun. "Fine," she sighed dramatically. "Come in. Try not to track in any existential dread. I just swept." The door swung open and King Hadrian stepped inside. The first thing Nix noticed was that he was imposing in a way the oral conduit hadn't prepared her for. He filled the doorway, all broad shoulders and effortless height. His black hair was cut short and practical, with just enough silver at the temples to signal that he'd crossed the century mark with his dignity intact. His face was sharp, lived in, not the eerie, timeless perfection of the truly ancient, but the face of a man who had spent 150 years making hard decisions, and it showed in the best possible way. He was, objectively, the most handsome man she had ever seen. It was deeply annoying. His eyes, a startling glacial blue, swept the room, taking in the towers of books, the cluttered desk, the bewildering number of tea tins. His expression was a carefully blank mask of royal composure, but Nix could see the faintest twitch in his jaw. He was horrified. Then his gaze landed on her, properly on her, not as a voice on the phone or a name on a page, but as a person. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He took in her ink-stained smock, her trousers, her messy knot of hair, and the fact that she was very obviously not an elderly gentleman. "You," he said, the single word carrying a century and a half of baffled authority. "Me," Nix confirmed, giving him a mock salute with her inky fingers. "Nix Ashmore, not N. Ashmore. The N stands for Nix. It's a girl's name. Marin is a coward who enjoys administrative simplicity over basic human decency." Hadrian stared at her. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He looked from her to the chaotic room and back again. It was the first time in a very long time that King Hadrian had been rendered completely speechless. Nyx felt a small, triumphant thrill. "You are the author of the Oakhaven Accords?" he finally managed to say. He sounded like he was accusing her of a crime. "And the Winter Solstice Proclamation," she added cheerfully. "And that rather moving eulogy for your third cousin, Barnaby, the one about his impressive collection of decorative spoons. That was a tough one. Not a lot of emotional depth in spoons." Hadrian just continued to stare. His internal monologue, Nyx imagined, was probably just a string of sputtering, incredulous error messages. Does not compute. Female. Young. Messy. Wrote the speech that averted the Goblin uprising. He finally seemed to reboot. He drew himself up to his full, intimidating height, his composure snapping back into place like a steel trap. "Miss Ashmore," he said, his voice once again the formal baritone of the king. "We have work to do. The Ironwood delegation arrives in less than 48 hours. Lord Marin has explained the unfortunate incident with Lord Cassian. He told me Cassian tried to compliment a bog and started a diplomatic crisis. I hear he's going swimming at dawn. Couldn't happen to a nicer man." She gestured vaguely towards a rickety-looking chair half buried under a pile of scrolls. "Have a seat, if you dare." Hadrian eyed the chair as if it might bite him. With a grace that seemed out of place in the cluttered room, he lifted the scrolls, placed them carefully on a nearby stack of books, and sat. The chair groaned in protest. "I do not merely wish to supervise," he began, steepling his long, elegant fingers. "I will be your partner in this endeavor. The Fae are not like our usual adversaries. They value poetry over logic and perceive insults where none are intended. The nuance must be perfect." "All right, partner," Nyx said, plopping back into her own chair. "Let's dance. What's the core message?" He looked at her, a flicker of something. Maybe respect, maybe just more confusion, in his eyes. "We need to convey strength without aggression. An offering of peace, but not a gesture of submission. We are the Night Court. We do not kneel, but we also do not wish to spend the next decade skirmishing over a patch of perpetually damp forest." Nyx grabbed a fresh sheet of parchment and dipped her quill. "Okay, strength without aggression, peace without submission. Got it. Give me a starting metaphor." "A new dawn," he said immediately. Nyx stopped writing. She looked at him. "A new dawn? For a species that is famously nocturnal and finds sunlight to be lethal? Are you trying to get us all killed?" Hadrian blinked. "It's a metaphor for a new beginning." "It's a terrible metaphor for your target audience. It's like giving a speech to a school of fish about the joys of desert landscapes. Know your room, Your Majesty." The muscles in his jaw tightened, that involuntary ghost reflex that vampires never quite shook, the body remembering embarrassment even when the blood had long since stopped cooperating. "I see," he said stiffly. "You believe you have a superior alternative?" "Obviously," she said. "We're the Night Court. Our power isn't in the sun, it's in the moon. The moon doesn't fight the tide, it commands it. It's silent, it's powerful, it's constant. We are not the dawn. We are the tide." She scribbled it down. "Our two peoples need not be the raging fire of the sun and the defiant shadow of the mountain. Let us instead be the moon and the tide, each powerful, each sovereign, bound by an ancient and immutable rhythm." She looked up. Hadrian was staring at her, his lips slightly parted. The mask of the king was gone, replaced by an expression of genuine astonishment. "That," he said slowly, "is very good." "I know," Nyx said, dipping her quill again. "It's my job. Now, about the second stanza. Are we talking about shared roots or intertwined branches? The Fae are very particular about their arboreal imagery." For the first time since he'd walked in, Hadrian smiled. It was a small, hesitant thing, but it transformed his face. The sharp authority softening into something warmer, something that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. Let us discuss the branches, he said, leaning forward. I have some thoughts. The work began. It was, as Nyx had predicted, a catastrophe, but not in the way she'd expected. It was a glorious, infuriating, exhilarating catastrophe. He spoke in concepts, she in specifics. He'd say something like, "We must allude to the ancient magic that binds these lands," and she'd fire back, "Allude how? Are we talking ley lines or the residual spirits of forgotten gods? Give me a noun." He had a fondness for archaic phrasing that she found exasperating. At one point, he suggested a line about their unwavering troth, and Nyx had to gently explain that the Fae might misinterpret it as a promise to give them all of the kingdom's goats. In turn, she used modern idioms that left him adrift. "We just need to vibe check the Fae Queen's position on water rights," she muttered at one point, chewing on the end of her quill. Hadrian stared at her. Vibe check? He repeated the words as if they were a foreign language he was trying to parse phonetically. Is that a form of scrying? It's a figure of speech, Nyx said, trying not to laugh. It means we need to gauge her emotional state, her general attitude. You wish to gauge her attitude, he repeated, a small frown creasing his brow. Why not simply say that? Says the man who wanted to pledge his troth to a goat-loving monarch, she shot back. He had the good grace to look chagrined. A fair point. As evening bled into the deep, star-dusted black of a vampire's day, a servant arrived with a tray. It held 2 crystal goblets of blood, the standard court provision, and, to Nyx's quiet gratitude, the small iron kettle she'd requested, along with her tin of Keeman black tea. Hadrian took his goblet without ceremony. Nyx took hers as well, but then turned to the kettle, pouring hot water over the loose leaves in her ceramic bowl with the focus of a chemist measuring reagents. The aroma of the Keemun, dark, faintly smoky with a winey sweetness underneath, unfurled through the small room. Hadrian, who had been staring intently at a draught, looked up. His nostrils flared slightly. She could see him processing the scent. Vampires could pull a smell apart the way a musician could separate instruments in an orchestra. He watched her lift the bowl to her face and inhale, her eyes closing. What, he said, are you doing? Thinking, she said, without opening her eyes. You are smelling a cup of tea. To think. The ritual focuses the mind. The aroma activates sensory memory. It's like, imagine the smell of a cathedral. Stone, old wood, candle wax. You don't need to pray in it to feel something shift in your brain. Same principle. You cannot taste it. Obviously, I can't taste it. I'm not delusional. I'm eccentric. There's a distinction. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he leaned forward slightly, and she realized he was trying to get a better angle on the smell. That's Keemun? Keemun Mao Feng, from Qimen. I have a contact in the human tea trade who thinks I'm a very particular restaurateur. She opened one eye. Are you smelling my tea? I am assessing the validity of your methodology, he said, with the dignity of a man who had been caught doing something he had absolutely no intention of admitting to. There's a Darjeeling second flush in the 3rd tin on the left, she said, if you want to assess more thoroughly. He did not take her up on the offer, but she noticed, later, that his gaze drifted to the tea shelf more than once, and that the corner of his mouth did something complicated each time. The work continued, but the dynamic had shifted. The frustration began to melt away, replaced by a strange collaborative energy. He would pace, narrating a story from his century and a half, a tense negotiation with a werewolf pack in the Eastern Territories, a philosophical debate with a sorcerer who'd since disappeared. And Nyx would find the core of it, the universal truth buried in the anecdote, and weave it into the speech. He had the experience, she had the precision. At one point, his frustration with a particularly tricky turn of phrase got the better of him. He stood up and began to pace, not with human steps, but with the blurring speed of a vampire. He was a flicker of black cloth and angry energy, a living shadow ricocheting around her small room. A stack of books on medieval siege tactics wobbled and then crashed to the floor. Nyx didn't even look up from her parchment. "Could you brood at a slower velocity? You're creating a draft and agitating my dust." The blur stopped. Hadrian was standing by the window, his back to her. There was a long silence. Then a low chuckle rumbled from his chest. It was a surprising, pleasant sound. "My apologies, Miss Ashmore," he said, turning around. He actually looked amused. "It has been a long time since anyone has critiqued the velocity of my brooding." The tension broke. He walked, at a normal pace, back to the chair and sat down. "Let's try the passage about the forest again," he said, "from the top." They worked through the night, the only sounds the scratch of her quill, the murmur of their voices, and the occasional frustrated sigh. Nyx brewed 3 more pots of tea, a habit that Hadrian initially watched with bemusement, then tolerance, then something approaching respect, particularly when he noticed that she wrote measurably faster in the first 5 minutes after a new brew. They argued about semicolons. They debated the merits of anaphora versus epistrophe. They built a speech, word by painstaking word. And somewhere in the long, dark hours, they started to build something else, too. The hour of the wolf, that deep, silent part of the night just before the first hint of dawn, is when the world feels thin. For humans, it's when nightmares are most potent and the body's defenses are at their lowest. For vampires, it was simply 4 in the morning. But even the undead felt the weight of that hour, a primal memory of vulnerability that no amount of immortality could quite erase. For Nyx, it was hour 26 without rest. And her brain was beginning to fray at the edges. She could go without sleep. All vampires could. But she was young enough that it still cost her something. A fraying of focus that older vampires handled more gracefully. She suspected Hadrian hadn't noticed. He looked exactly as he had a day ago, composed, alert, sharp-jawed. 20-odd years of additional practice at endurance apparently made all the difference. She was slumped over her desk, staring at a single infuriating sentence. "We offer a hand not in supplication, but in shared purpose." "It's flaccid," she declared to the room. Hadrian, who was perched on the edge of her windowsill looking out at the city lights beyond the castle's concealment wards, the hidden world layered over the human one, visible only to those who knew where to look, turned his head. "Flaccid," he repeated, one eyebrow raised. "Limp, lifeless. It's a corporate memo. Shared purpose. We might as well invite them to a team-building retreat." She rubbed her temples, a headache blooming behind her eyes. "It needs poetry. It needs blood." An interesting choice of words, he noted, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "You know what I mean." She leaned back, her chair creaking ominously. "This is the heart of the speech. It's the turn. Everything before it is preamble. Everything after is resolution. This line has to sing." He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze lost in the darkness outside. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it, stripped of its royal cadence. "When I was young," he began, "barely 30 years into my condition, I tried to forge an alliance with the mountain clans to the north. I thought power was the only language they would understand. I arrived with 100 of my best soldiers. I made demands. I spoke of empire, of fealty, of strength." Nyx listened, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. He wasn't talking as the king now. He was talking as a man, remembering a mistake he'd made over a century ago. The clan chief, an old vampire named Bren, just listened. When I was finished, he didn't respond with threats. He just asked me if I had ever tried to build a house by myself. "What did you say?" Nyx whispered. "I told him I had architects for that." He smiled and said, "An alliance is not a fortress you seize. It is a home you must build together. It is slow. It is frustrating. You will argue over the placement of every stone." He paused. He was no longer looking at the window. He was looking at her, and something in his expression had changed. The careful distance collapsing, the 70 years between them suddenly irrelevant. "And you will want to stop," he continued, his voice dropping. "And you must not." The last words hung in the room. They were Bren's words, but they were no longer about the mountain clans. Nyx held very still. She could hear the silence in the spaces between his sentences, the silence of a man who had just said something he hadn't planned to say. His jaw tightened. She saw the exact moment he realized what he'd done. His eyes shifted, the openness shuddering, the king reassembling himself from the inside out. "It was a valuable lesson," he said, and his voice was formal again. A door closed mid-swing. "The core principle applies to the Fey negotiation. The speech should convey that patience is not weakness." He was retreating. She could feel it like a change in air pressure, the warmth pulling back, the distance re-establishing itself. The anecdote had become just an anecdote. The man had become the king. But Nyx was a linguist. She had spent her entire life listening for the thing underneath the thing that was said. And what she had heard in the way he said "you must not stop" was not a lesson about the mountain clans. It was a man telling her, telling himself, not to walk away from whatever was happening in this room at 4 a.m. She didn't say any of that. She just picked up her quill. "The house metaphor," she said quietly. "That's the line." She wrote it. "An alliance is not a territory to be conquered. It is a country to be built, stone by stone, word by word, with the patience of those who know that anything worth building will survive the arguments over where the stones should go." She read it back. He nodded, once, his expression unreadable. "Good," he said. "We are nearly finished." They wrote the remaining passages in near silence. The ease of the earlier hours was gone, replaced by something taut and careful. They were both aware of the grenade he had dropped, and they were both stepping delicately around it. When the speech was done, Hadrian stood. He needed to prepare for the summit, meet with the Elder Council, review security protocols, change into his most imposing formal wear. He moved towards the door, every inch the monarch once more. He paused at the threshold. "Your Majesty?" she asked, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. He didn't turn around. "How is my collar?" he asked, his voice tight. "Is it straight?" Nyx blinked. He had no reflection. None of them did. But most vampires his age had long since developed systems, a trusted valet, a specific routine. That he was asking her meant he either didn't want to go find his valet, or he wanted a reason to not walk out the door yet. She could have said, "It's fine." She could have said, "Turn around, let me look." She could have kept her distance, answered with words, which was what she did with everything and everyone. Instead, she got up from her chair. Her legs felt unsteady. 26 hours of work and the aftershock of what he'd said still ringing in her ears. She walked over to him. She stood behind him and reached up, her fingers brushing the cold, still skin of his neck as she adjusted the high, stiff collar of his coat. Nyx Ashmore did not touch people, not casually, not professionally, not at all if she could help it. She'd built her entire life around the distance that parchment and quills and closed doors afforded. She communicated through words on a page, through pneumatic tubes, through a brass device on her desk. She had not voluntarily touched another person in years. Her fingers were on his neck. She felt him go rigid. Not the controlled stillness of a king, something raw, something involuntary, a tension that ran through his entire body like a struck chord. She heard the faintest sound, barely perceptible, of his fangs descending a fraction, the way they did when a vampire's body responded to something before the mind could intervene. He caught it immediately, jaw clenching to force them back, but she'd heard it, and they both knew she'd heard it. "It was crooked," she said softly. He didn't move. "And now?" She smoothed the rich black velvet, her fingers lingering a half-second longer than the task required. She could feel the architecture of his spine through the fabric, the coiled stillness of a man who was using 150 years of self-control to not turn around. "Now," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "you look like you could stop a war." A long silence. She could feel him on the edge of something, the same edge she'd heard in his voice when he said, "You must not stop." The air between them was so charged it felt solid. Then he stepped forward, through the door, out of her reach. The cool air of the stairwell rushed in to fill the space where he had been. "Thank you, Nix," he said, without looking back. And then he was gone, his footsteps descending the spiral staircase in that measured, unhurried rhythm that she would hear in her sleep, if she ever slept again. She stood in the doorway for a long time, her hands at her sides, the ghost of his collar still imprinted on her fingertips. The speech was finished, the collar was straight, and she had no idea whether he had left because of duty or because she had terrified him. The gilded summit was, by all accounts, a triumph. Nix listened from her tower, the aural conduit humming on her desk, a freshly brewed pot of silver needle going cold beside her. She didn't need to see him, she could picture it perfectly. Hadrian, standing tall and composed amidst the glittering, hostile Fey delegation, his voice a calm and steady anchor in a sea of tension. He delivered their speech flawlessly. He paused in all the right places. His emphasis was perfect. When he reached the heart of it, the hall fell into a profound silence. An alliance is not a territory to be conquered. It is a country to be built, stone by stone, word by word, with the patience of those who know that anything worth building will survive the arguments over where the stones should go. The pause he left after the line was exactly right. 3 full seconds, she counted. The Fey Queen, a terrifyingly beautiful creature with eyes like chips of emerald, was said to have shed a single glittering tear. The treaty was signed. The war was averted. Lord Marin, in his report to Nix, described the mood as cautiously jubilant, with a significant decrease in the ambient threat of being turned into a bog creature. He also noted, with what Nix suspected was grim satisfaction, that Lord Cassian had been dispatched to the Ironwood Bog at dawn as agreed, and that early reports described him as damp and philosophically diminished. Nix sent a brief professional note back. Pleased the summit was a success, awaiting next assignment. She expected to go back to her life, to the comfortable solitude, the quiet companionship of her books, the impersonal exchange of notes and drafts. She tried to settle back into her routine. She tidied her desk. She organized her quills. She rearranged her tea shelf by oxidation level, then by region, then back to oxidation level. She tried to read a history of pre-Roman vampire settlements in Gaul, but the silence in the tower was different now. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the specific silence of something missing, like a room where music had been playing for hours and then stopped. She kept catching herself staring at the chair he'd sat in, which had developed a slight lean from bearing the weight of a brooding monarch. She'd tried to sit in it herself once, and it felt wrong. She'd moved back to her own chair and then felt ridiculous for having feelings about furniture. She replayed the Bren story in her mind. You will want to stop, and you must not. Had he meant it? Had he even known he meant it? Or was she doing what she always did with words, reading too much into them, finding subtext where there was only text, constructing a narrative from a handful of syllables that the speaker had already forgotten? And the collar, her fingers on his neck, the sound of his fangs, the way he had walked away. Every time she heard a footstep on the stair, her heart leaped, and every time it passed her door, it sank. 2 days after the summit, there was a knock on her door. Sharp, precise. 3 distinct raps. Her heart did a painful little flip. It couldn't be. She opened the door. It was him. Hadrian stood there, not in his formal royal attire, but in a simple, well-cut black shirt and trousers. He looked different out of the formal coat. Younger, less like a monument and more like a man. In his hand he held a thin, leather-bound book. He stood patiently at the threshold, a small, almost shy smile on his face. He was waiting. The invitation. The stupid, fundamental rule that had suddenly become their private ritual. Nyx felt a smile bloom on her own face, a real, genuine thing that made her cheeks ache. Something tight in her chest released. Not all the way, but enough to breathe. "I was in the lower library," he said, his voice a low, pleasant rumble. "And I came across this. It's a first edition of Alastair's Meditations on the Common Tongue. I remembered our discussion on the evolution of idiomatic phrases and thought, you might appreciate it." It was the flimsiest excuse she had ever heard. The lower library was a maze of forgotten lore that took junior scribes weeks to navigate. He hadn't just come across it, he had gone looking for it. For her. She stepped back, holding the door wide. "Come in, Hadrian," she said. The sound of his name, spoken aloud in her room, felt both strange and perfectly right. He stepped across the threshold, and the empty space in the room was suddenly full again. He settled into the leaning chair, his chair, she had started thinking of it, which was pathetic. And they talked about Alastair's work for an hour. They argued about whether the common tongue had degraded or evolved over the past century. He maintained, with the authority of someone who'd been paying attention for 50 years longer than she had, that the loss of formal register in diplomatic correspondence was a slow-moving catastrophe. She countered that language was a living thing, and that clinging to dead grammatical forms was like insisting everyone still travel by horse because cars lacked character. "Cars lack a great many things," he said darkly, "including dignity." "You have opinions about cars?" "I have opinions about everything. It is the curse of outliving your patients for keeping them to yourself." At some point during the argument, she brewed a pot of Ali Shan oolong, Taiwanese, high mountain, with an aroma like wildflowers and clean, cold air. And without thinking about it, poured a second bowl and set it on the edge of his armrest. He looked at it. He looked at her. He picked it up, held it to his face, and inhaled. He didn't say anything, but he held the bowl for a long time. Neither of them mentioned the Bren story. Neither of them mentioned the collar. But when he left an hour later, the room felt warm, and the chair leaned a little more. He came back the next day, this time with a map of the northern wastes, wanting her opinion on the naming conventions for a new settlement. They spent the first 20 minutes on the map. They spent the next 40 minutes on a tangent about whether Blackmoor was an acceptably dramatic name for a vampire outpost, or whether it sounded, as Nyx argued, like a goth teenager's Tumblr handle. "I do not know what a Tumblr is," Hadrian said with the dignified bewilderment of a man who had survived 2 world wars but could not survive the internet. "But I resent the comparison." On the third visit, he brought nothing but a question about a historical text he was reading. He didn't even pretend to have a reason. On the fourth visit, Nyx noticed something. He was standing by her bookshelf, examining a spine, and he reached out and, without thinking, without asking, nudged a stack of loose papers into a neater pile. It was a tiny, unconscious gesture. She watched his hand, those long, elegant fingers pressing the papers into alignment, and remembered the sound she'd heard at the collar, that barely there descent of fangs, and had to look away. On the fifth visit, she caught him doing it again. This time, he'd moved a tottering column of books from the floor to a shelf, silently, while she was mid-sentence about Fey water rights. "Are you tidying my room?" she asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. He froze, his hand still on the spine of an almanac. "I am ensuring the structural integrity of your literary collection." You're tidying. You're the king of the night court, and you're tidying my room like a disapproving grandmother. The word grandmother is unnecessarily gendered and deeply inaccurate. You alphabetized my poetry section last Tuesday. I saw it when you left. A pause. It was in a state of considerable disarray. It was in my state of disarray. I had a system. Your system, he said carefully, appeared to be organized by the principle of gravitational collapse. She threw a cushion at him. He caught it, of course, vampire reflexes, but the look of startled, dignified offense on his face was worth everything. The sixth visit was when things went wrong. Nix was in the middle of explaining the difference between a semicolon and an M-dash, a subject she felt strongly about and Hadrian found inexplicably fascinating, when footsteps sounded on the staircase. Not Hadrian's measured stride, not Marin's shuffling urgency. These were quick, purposeful clicking steps. The door, which Hadrian had left slightly ajar, swung open without a knock. Lady Iselda stood in the doorway. She was one of the Elder Council's senior members, tall, glacially beautiful, dressed in midnight silk, with the kind of smile that had preceded several notable political assassinations over the decades. Her eyes swept the room in one efficient pass. The king sitting in a rickety chair, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, a book in his lap. Nix, cross-legged on her desk, a quill behind her ear, mid-gesticulation. 2 ceramic bowls of tea, the ritual that had, without discussion, become theirs. The comfortable, unmistakable ease of 2 people who had been talking for hours. Your Majesty, Lady Iselda said, her voice like polished silver. I was told I might find you here. The council has been waiting for your input on the northern trade routes. She let her gaze drift to Nix with studied, deliberate curiosity. And you must be the mysterious N. Ashmore. How unexpected. The word unexpected did an extraordinary amount of work. It conveyed surprise, judgment, and the promise of gossip in a single elegant package. Hadrian rose from his chair, the casual warmth gone, the king clicking back into place. Lady Iselda, I was not aware the council session had been moved forward. It hasn't. I took the liberty. Your prolonged absences from the administrative wing have been noted. Another glance at Nix, another smile. I'm certain this is purely professional. The court will be relieved to hear it. She left. The clicking footsteps descended the staircase, each one landing like a dropped pin in the silence she'd created. Nix sat very still. Her chest felt tight, the old familiar ice spreading through her ribs. This is how it starts. A visit, a smile, a word placed carefully where it would do the most damage. Lady Iselda would return to the court, and by midnight, the story would be everywhere. The king's speechwriter, young, female, living in the East Tower, visited daily. She knew what came next. She had watched it happen to her parents. The slow, deliberate dismantling, the scrutiny, the speculation, the faction building. Someone would decide she was useful. Someone else would decide she was a threat. And then the grinding machine of court politics would do what it always did. Nix, Hadrian said. His voice was quiet. You should go, she said. Her own voice was flat, the warmth of the last hour scraped away. The council is waiting. The council can wait. The council is going to eat me alive, she said, and the words came out harder than she intended. Iselda just took a photograph with her eyes. By tomorrow, every ambitious lord and scheming lady in this castle is going to know exactly who I am, where I live, and how often you visit. That's not gossip, Hadrian. That's a targeting map, and you know what they do with targets. Fenwick is proof of that. The invocation of Fenwick's name, burned alive in his own quarters, landed hard. She saw it register in his face. He was silent. She could feel him watching her, but she couldn't look at him. If she looked at him, she'd see the understanding in his face, and that would make it worse, because understanding didn't stop the machine. "I will speak to Iselda," he said. "And say what? Please don't tell anyone I've been visiting my secret speechwriter every afternoon? That's not a solution, that's a headline." A long silence, then. "You are right. I have been careless." The word careless landed between them like a stone in still water. He hadn't said wrong. He'd said careless. The distinction mattered, and they both knew it. He left. The room was quiet again. Nick sat on her desk and stared at the wall, and thought about her father's letters of appeal stacked in a box under her bed. She hadn't opened the box in years. She didn't need to. She knew what was in them. Hope, degrading into pleading, degrading into silence. The knock came the following evening. 3 raps. She almost didn't open it. She opened it. Hadrian stood at the threshold. He looked different. Not physically. He always looked the same, the bastard, 150 years of sharp-jawed composure. But something in his bearing was off. The king's posture was there, the straight spine and squared shoulders, but it was like scaffolding around something uncertain. "I spoke to the Elder Council this morning," he said without preamble. "I informed them that I have been consulting directly with the Crown's chief linguistic advisor on matters of state rhetoric, a practice I intend to continue and expand. I have created a formal advisory position with appropriate clearance and security designation. It was recorded in the council minutes. The position carries the same protections that should have been afforded to Fenwick: fireproofed quarters, wards on the stairwell, and political immunity equivalent to a council seat." Nick stared at him. "You created a job title? With fireproofing?" "I created a political shield, and a literal one. Iselda can gossip about a mysterious woman in a tower. She cannot gossip about a formally appointed crown advisor exercising her duties. And no one can burn you out of your home." He said this with the matter-of-fact tone of a man who had been playing politics for 150 years and could build a defensive fortification out of bureaucracy before breakfast. "You did this overnight?" she asked. "I do not sleep," he reminded her. "I had time." She stood in the doorway, her hand on the frame, and felt something crack in her chest. Not break, crack, like ice in spring. He hadn't dismissed her fear. He hadn't told her she was overreacting. He'd heard her, heard the name Fenwick in her voice and understood what it meant. And then he'd spent his sleepless night building her a fortress out of the only material the court respected: institutional power. And then he'd fireproofed it. "That," she said slowly, "is the most romantic thing anyone has ever done with a job title." The faintest flicker crossed his face, the muscles around his eyes tightening, the ghost reflex of a reaction his body couldn't quite complete anymore. "It is merely administrative," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Come in, Hadrian," she said. He stepped across the threshold. The ritual held. They didn't talk about the job title. They didn't talk about Iselda. They talked about a border dispute in the eastern provinces that needed a statement, and whether the word sovereignty had become so overused in diplomatic contexts that it had lost all meaning. She brewed a pot of gyokuro, Japanese green, deeply vegetal, like standing in a shaded forest, and placed a bowl on his armrest without comment. He picked it up, inhaled, and held it against his chest while they argued about comma placement. "This one is different," he said eventually, still holding the bowl. "Gyokuro, shade-grown. The leaves never see direct sunlight." "How appropriate. I thought you'd appreciate the solidarity." The laugh came back. That real, unguarded sound that filled her small room and made the books feel lighter on their shelves. The visits continued. With the formal appointment in place, they settled into a rhythm that was half professional, half something neither of them named. He brought questions about policy language. She brought drafts of upcoming speeches. They worked, and they argued, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with work. His memory of the first time he'd seen an electric light, I found it aggressive. Her theory about why all vampire architecture defaulted to Gothic. Because you're all deeply unserious people pretending to be serious. His quiet admission that the thing he missed most about being alive was the taste of bread. Her quiet admission that she sometimes talked to her books when she'd been alone too long. "Do they talk back?" he asked, with genuine interest. "The philosophy section is very judgmental." Philosophy usually is. She noticed that he always chose the gyokuro when she offered. The shade-grown tea for the man who hadn't seen sunlight in 150 years. She didn't comment on it. Some things were better left as the quiet rituals they were. On a late afternoon 3 weeks after the summit, Hadrian arrived with a new assignment. A speech for the annual midwinter address. Largely ceremonial, a chance for the king to speak to the common people of the Night Court about renewal, perseverance, the usual. It should have been simple. They worked on it for 2 hours. The opening was strong. The middle section, about the resilience of communities that had weathered border conflicts, was solid. Then they hit the closing. "It needs a final image," Nick said, chewing her quill. "Something that ties it together. The whole speech is about what holds people together through difficult times. We need a metaphor that lands." Hadrian was at the window, his preferred thinking spot. He was quiet for a long time. "What if," he said slowly, "we spoke about the nature of language itself?" "Go on." "The common people, they do not think about treaties or borders. They think about the words they say to each other, the promises they make, the things they choose to say and choose not to say." He paused. "What if the closing argued that the most important alliance in any kingdom is not between nations, but between two people who choose their words carefully with each other?" Nyx wrote it down as he spoke, her quill moving fast. The words came to her shaped by his idea, but sharper, more specific. The strongest treaty ever written was not signed in a great hall. It was spoken quietly, between two people who chose, despite every reason not to say the truest thing they knew. She read it back to him. He was very still. His eyes were on the parchment, but his expression was the one she had seen exactly twice before. Once during the Bren story, once when her fingers were on his collar. Open, unguarded, dangerous. "That is not about the common people," he said quietly. "No," Nyx agreed, her voice barely audible. "It isn't." The silence that followed was so heavy it had texture. They both knew what the line was about. They both knew the other knew. And unlike the Bren story, unlike the collar, there was nowhere to retreat, no anecdote to hide behind, no formal duty waiting downstairs. Just a line on a parchment that said everything. Hadrian looked at her. The mask was gone. "You will want to stop," he said softly. "And you must not." His own words. Bren's words. Thrown back into the room, stripped of all pretense, aimed directly at her. Nyx set down her quill. "Are you quoting yourself at me?" "I am quoting a wise man I once knew." "You're quoting a wise man at me to avoid saying what you actually mean. Which is a rhetorical strategy I specifically warned you about in the margin notes of the Solstice Proclamation." Something cracked in his composure. Not the mask falling, but something behind it giving way. He looked at her, and the vulnerability in his face was so stark it was almost unbearable. Not because it was dramatic, because it was small. He just looked like a man who was afraid of saying the wrong word to the one person for whom words mattered most. "I find," he said, each word arriving separately, like he was testing the weight of it before letting it go. that I have built a very impressive kingdom, and it is a very lonely country. And the only time it has not felt lonely is in this room, arguing about semicolons. It was not eloquent. It was not polished. It did not have a tripartite structure or an elegant callback or a single rhetorical device she could diagram. It was the most honest thing she had ever heard him say. That, Nick said, was terrible. Structurally unsound. No central metaphor. The semicolons bit undermined the emotional climax. I am aware. You should have let me write it. I wanted to say it myself. Badly, apparently. She stood up from her chair. He watched her, unmoving, that painful openness still in his face. She walked over to him, the same walk she had made to fix his collar, except this time she didn't stop behind him. She stopped in front of him, close enough to feel the cold that radiated from his skin, and looked up into the sharp, uncertain face of a man who had ruled a kingdom for decades and could not manage a single declarative sentence about his own feelings. For the record, she said, your delivery has always been your weakest skill, but your instincts are occasionally, very occasionally, correct. She reached up and straightened his collar. It didn't need straightening. They both knew it didn't need straightening. Nix, he said. His voice was rough. I would like to invite you to walk with me in the moonlit gardens tonight. The gardens, a public space where anyone could see them. The old fear was there. She felt it, the tightening in her chest, the cold along her spine. Lady Iselda's smile, her father's letters, the grinding machine. But she also felt his collar under her fingers, and the formal appointment he'd built overnight, fireproofing and all. And the 3 weeks of daily visits, where he'd never once asked her to be anything other than exactly who she was. He wasn't asking her to enter the viper's pit. He was asking her to walk beside the man who'd spent his sleepless night building her armor. Okay, she whispered. A walk sounds nice. He led her from the tower, his hand holding hers as if it were the most natural thing in the world. As they descended the spiral staircase, they passed Lord Marin on his way up, likely to deliver some report. Marin stopped, his gaze dropping to their joined hands. He looked up at Hadrian, then at Nyx. He took in her nervous expression and the king's quiet determination. A small, tired, but deeply genuine smile touched Marin's lips. He didn't say a word. He just gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of approval, the silent blessing of a man who had seen everything and was finally seeing something new and good. Then he continued on his way, leaving them to theirs. They stepped out into the night. The gardens were bathed in the soft silver light of the moon, the real one, the only one, hanging enormous and ancient over the rooftops of a city that had no idea the night court existed beneath its feet. Beyond the concealment wards, London hummed with its usual oblivious human energy. Inside the wards, the garden was silent, old, and lit entirely by moonlight and the faint glow of enchanted lanterns. A group of courtiers passed them on the path, 2 lords and a lady, their conversation dying mid-sentence as they registered who was walking and who was walking with him. Nyx felt their eyes like pinpricks. Her grip on Hadrian's hand tightened involuntarily. He didn't squeeze back. Instead, he did something worse. He slowed his pace, fractionally, so that they were walking at the unhurried stroll of 2 people who had absolutely nowhere else to be. It was a king's move, deliberate, visible, unhurried. Look, it said, this is not a secret. The courtiers passed. The garden swallowed them up again. Your hand is shaking, Hadrian observed. Your hand is freezing, she shot back. I'm not shaking, I'm shivering. There's a thermodynamic distinction. There is not. You are a vampire. You do not shiver. I am a vampire with an overdeveloped startle reflex and you are a pedant. There's a distinction there, too." They stopped by a marble fountain, the water whispering over stone. The sounds of the distant court were a faint murmur, a world away. Here, in the moonlight, it was just the two of them. Hadrian turned to face her, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "I have been overthinking this for approximately 3 weeks," he said, his voice a low, intimate rumble. "I consulted Marin." "You consulted Marin? About this?" "He has over a century of experience navigating delicate situations." "What did he say?" "He said, 'Your Majesty, you have brokered peace with the Fae and survived Lord Cassian's prose. I am confident you can manage a kiss without my assistance.'" And then he walked away. Nyx laughed. It burst out of her, bright and uncontrolled, and it echoed through the garden, and for a moment the fear and the politics and the decades between them were all just very far away. Hadrian watched her laugh, and his face did the thing where the mask dissolved and there was just a man, looking at a woman like she'd invented something he'd forgotten existed. He leaned in. He was not the king, not the seasoned monarch, but just Hadrian, and he kissed her. It was a gentle, hesitant kiss, full of all the questions he hadn't known how to ask, and all the answers she was just beginning to understand. It was the quiet after the storm, the peace after the war, the last word of a speech that had been writing itself for weeks. When he pulled back, his blue eyes were searching hers, looking for something, an answer. Nyx felt a slow, brilliant smile spread across her face. The fear was still there. She'd be lying if she said it wasn't. But it was smaller now, and the thing beside it, the thing that had been growing in a cluttered tower room over arguments and shared silences and 2 ceramic bowls of tea that neither of them could taste, was much, much bigger. "For the record," she said, her voice full of a warmth she hadn't known she possessed, "your delivery was perfect. But the pacing was off. You should have kissed me 2 weeks ago." Hadrian stared at her for a second, his serious expression melting away, and then he threw his head back and laughed. It was a real, deep, unkingly sound of pure joy that echoed through the garden, startling the sleeping flowers. "Noted," he said. "I will defer to my speechwriter's expertise on timing in all future matters." "All future matters," she repeated. "I'm going to hold you to that." "I expect nothing less." He kissed her again, and this time she kissed him back, and the garden was quiet around them, and somewhere in the distance the fountain whispered over stone, and the moon watched, the real one, the only one, the same one that had watched over the hidden world and the human one for longer than either of them had been alive. And the country they were building, word by word, argument by argument, stone by patient stone, had its first real foundation.